For thousands of years, the grammar translate method, as it's called, has been used for teaching a second language.
This is false. The grammar translation method was developed by German scholars in the 19th century by people like H.S. Ohlendorf and Johann Meidinger, and it only became dominant in the 1840s in America and Europe. It has its roots in the decline of Latin as a living language in the 16th to 18th centuries. But even during this time, academics routinely learned to speak Latin alongside learning the grammar rules.
There is a sort of a trend, if you like, that's arguing from the linguistics world that really the grammar translate method does not work.
This is not just a trend. It is based on the scientific study of language and the lack of evidence for the grammar translation method. Here's what Jack Richards and Theodore Rogers say about the grammar translation method in their book, Approaches and Methods in Language Teaching. Consequently, though it may be true to say that the grammar translation method is still widely practiced, it has no advocates. It is a method for which there is no theory. There is no literature that offers a rationale or justification for it or that attempts to relate it to issues in linguistics, psychology, or educational theory.
Now, both the grammar translate method and the natural language approach have both existed side by side for millennia. You could argue perhaps that the natural language approach is the older approach because it's frankly what we've used to learn living languages. When you go into an immersive environment, you will learn a language just by picking up individual words and how they're strung together in a very organic kind of way. However, starting from about the time of Aristotle and Plato, around that time, people started to work with the grammar translate method. They developed this method because it was a really fast way to start to learn to read books from ancient cultures. And so it was a really attractive approach for doing it.
Again, this is wrong. When the ancients taught grammar, they did not teach it as a means to read. In order to read, you have to learn to use the language. And that means learning to speak, listen, write, and, of course, read the language. For example, the 1st century Roman rhetorician Quintilian talks about children learning both Latin and Greek from hearing and speaking it in the home. Grammar books from the 4th century AD suggest that the grammar of languages was taught in the language itself, implying that the students already knew how to use the language before they studied its grammar.
The grammar translate method refers to this method where we teach grammar and then we explain how this works in another language, and then you can learn that other language by understanding the grammar. Hence the grammar, and we then go to translate the material in that other language into our own native or heart language, if you want to call it that.
This is the fundamental issue. Learning another language, or knowing a language to begin with, is about one's ability to use the language. It is not about knowing the grammar of that language. I know that Russian has a set of suffixes that indicate whether or not the verbal predicate is telic or atelic because I've read about what those suffixes do in linguistics works on tense and aspect. But this certainly does not mean I know Russian, and it will basically help me zero if I try to read Russian. Understanding the grammar of another language will help you very little in your ability to use that language.
The point here is to argue that because we no longer teach grammar to children and we therefore as adults no longer know grammar, we come to the grammar translate method without what I would say is the prerequisite knowledge to actually take advantage of these materials that have been written for us. And as a result, we look at those books and those tools and we say they just don't work. So let's ask the question, is the grammar translate method the problem in this situation?
Yes, the method is the problem. Teaching a language through grammar is like teaching someone to play the violin through a music theory class. Music theory might help you a little if you already know how to play the violin, but it will not, in and of itself, help you to acquire the skill to play. For that, you need practice.
Do my students who are going to pick this book up have the educational prerequisites to be able to actually use the material that I'm writing? And so I think there is, to some extent, a requirement on the authors of books to actually teach grammar well. And to be certain, many grammars, Greek grammars in particular I'm talking about here, do actually teach some English grammar pretty well. I think Bill Mounce in Basics of Biblical Greek does a pretty reasonable job of it.
So the most popular Greek textbook on the market teaches English grammar well. Then shouldn't there be no problem?
The argument that I'm trying to address here is that those people who say the grammar translate method doesn't work. My argument here is actually we're trying to blame the tool when really the problem is actually with the user of the tool.
Even teachers in seminary who use the grammar translation method to teach Greek agree that the method does not adequately prepare students to use the language. In David Miller's book, Greek Pedagogy in Crisis, he surveys 30 teachers about current Greek pedagogical methodologies, most of whom use the grammar translation method. According to his survey, 97% of these experts say that GTM's learning objectives cannot be met without further study. But 86% of the students are not electing to sign up for the advanced courses. So, the GTM is not adequately preparing students, and it is discouraging students from continuing in the language. But it is not the problem.
So we can't necessarily blame the tools when there's been a larger issue taking place underneath the tools and they haven't, and here's where I go back to my perhaps, yes, there's a responsibility on the authors here, they haven't really kept up with that ground shift that takes place or has taken place underneath them.
But didn't you just say that the Greek textbooks actually do a decent job of teaching English grammar? If learning the grammar was the way to learn a language, and Greek grammars teach both English and Greek grammar well, then there should be no problem.
So I think we need to be wiser about the way we talk about the grammar translate method. It's been used for centuries. Why would we suddenly now have a problem with it?
It hasn't been used for centuries. And as early as the mid-19th century, just a few decades after it became widespread, scholars began to object to its use. Unfortunately, it had become the dominant paradigm despite having no data to back it up. And that's why language scholars then and now have a problem with it. It is a method with no theory and has no justification for use.
So many students who start with the grammar translate method, they actually end up losing their Greek. And again, does this mean that the grammar translate method is the problem, or is there something else going on here?
It's true. Most students don't go on to use their Greek. According to Miller's survey, only 12% of the professors surveyed say that students go on to use New Testament Greek in their ministry.
You learn those basic skills required to actually read the text, and then you suddenly stop before you've actually acquired skill with that new knowledge.
This assumes that the grammar translation method gives you the skills to read. This, again, is wrong. My 4-year-old knows how to read, but he knows zero grammar. Zero. Doesn't know what a noun is, doesn't know what a verb is, nothing. Nada. And Darryl just told us that there is widespread ignorance of grammar. If learning the grammar gives you the ability to read, and almost no one knows grammar, shouldn't we expect almost no one to be able to read? We should, but this is false. Plenty of people can still read English even though we don't teach as much English grammar in schools. You don't need to know the grammar of a language to use the language. And since reading is using the language, you don't need to know the grammar in order to read. Students can't read after a Greek course in the grammar translation method because that method doesn't give students the skills required to read. Reading is about comprehending the words represented with a written text at a pace that mimics spoken language. It is not about being able to describe the grammar. The skills necessary for reading, such as being able to quickly understand the meaning of words and syntactic structures, are not practiced in the grammar translation method.
In most seminaries, they're not actually going to give you the instructions for how to gain that experience and how to gain those skills. And in many cases, the actual professors teaching you won't have those skills themselves.
The claim is that neither professors nor students can read the text well, but this is a necessary skill. If the people teaching and learning from the grammar translation method can't read well, then the method is not producing adequate readers. The underlying claim in this entire section is that after a course taught with the grammar translation method, you need to develop the skill of reading. Why? Because you haven't developed it in GTM, which is just to say that GTM hasn't taught you to use the language. If this is all about keeping up your Greek, the whole idea is that you need to learn to read to keep up your Greek. Since GTM doesn't teach you to read, it won't help you keep it up. So a class entirely devoted to that method is indeed the problem. It does not teach the skills necessary for reading or continued progression in the language.
So from my point of view, I actually don't think, I am not convinced that the grammar translate method is a big problem.
So even though the title of this video is Why the Current Approach to Teaching New Testament Greek Doesn't Work, it is actually a defense of that approach. The problem is that there is no data to support the grammar translation method. To repeat Richards and Rogers once again, there is no literature that offers a rationale or justification for it, or that attempts to relate it to issues in linguistics, psychology, or educational theory. The grammar translation method is not an age-old, tried and true method for learning languages. It is a method invented in the 19th century which has no data to support it, and which has no advocates in the world of second language acquisition, the academic study of how to learn a second language. Indeed, the current approach to teaching New Testament Greek doesn't work.